To the speaker whom definitely there is no need to introduce neither in English nor in Russian. Just to keep the tradition, I will do it in Russian, if you don't mind. Итак, я предоставляю с огромным удовольствием слово профессору Дагласу Олсону, профессору университета университета Миннесоты, ныне пребывающим как почетный гумбольдтовский стипендиат в университете Фрайбурга. Профессор Олсон занимается всеми практически аспектами греческой и всеми периодами греческой литературы, от эпоса до гораздо более поздних вещей. Его первая книга была посвящена Одиссее, Blood and Iron. Затем его главная тема последнего времени — это комедия. Им было в Оксфорде опубликовано сразу несколько комментированных изданий аристофановских комедий «Мир», «О Хармене» и «Женщины на празднике Фисмофорий». А сейчас, насколько я выяснил, профессор Олсон работает над полным лейбовским изданием «Афинея». Так что мы чрезвычайно рады. We are very happy to have Professor Olson here. Please.
Thank you. And particularly because I'm perhaps the last speaker, I want to repeat thanks of the international speakers, in particular to Professor Grinzer and to all of you for really making this a wonderful and exciting conference. So thank you very much. Professor Grinzer, ladies and gentlemen, the general topic of this meeting is structure in drama. And what I plan to discuss today are some aspects of how we go about recovering structure in the case of extremely fragmentary material, especially lost comedies. In what follows, I treat specific texts and problems, but I also have larger points to make. On the one hand, arguing for caution in regard to what we can and cannot regard as settled about the basic dramatic arc or storyline of individual lost plays, while on the other hand advocating openness to a larger set of possibilities than is sometimes allowed for. Comedy, as we know it, seems to have been fundamentally dependent on wild acts of imagination and fantastic reworkings of traditional material, and we ought to beware of too aggressively boxing its impulses in, given how little we know about most of the authors and plays we deal with. My primary topic will be Crataena's Lost Odysseus, usually translated Odysseus and his companions, in particular fragment 147 of that comedy, and the larger question of what can reasonably be called Cyclops plays. As a way of illustrating and articulating the problems I raise, however, I begin with completely different material, fragments 2 to 5 of the late 5th, early 4th century comic poet Nicophon from his Birth of Aphrodite, items 1A to D on your handout. And maybe I'll just wait until everybody's got the handout. It'll be a little bit easier. Little more is known of Nicophon's Birth of Aphrodite than what you see in front of you. All the same, a way of tying together the fragments presented here into something approaching a coherent storyline readily presents itself. The action presumably takes place on the divine level, and the only divine character likely to carry a messenger staff, in fragment 2, is Hermes, who seems to be engaged with a scuffle with someone else, most likely another male god. The reference to spider webs and traps in fragments 3 to 4 is easily taken to be part of a reworking of the story in Odyssey 8 of how Ares and Aphrodite were caught in bed together by Aphrodite's husband Hephaestus. Compare item 2A, an incident in which the Homeric Hermes has a part as an amused but jealous spectator, and fragment 5 can then be understood as a summons by one character, perhaps Hephaestus, compare item 2B, to another to come enjoy the lover's humiliation. One might object to this reconstruction that the title of Nicophon's play is The Birth of Aphrodite, not The Romantic Misadventures of Ares and Aphrodite or the like. But Aphrodite was born, full-formed and beautiful, and the sixth Homeric hymn, item 2c, reports that the moment she entered the company of the other Olympians, the male gods all begged for the right to take her as their wife. Hence, perhaps, Hermes jostling with another character in fragment 2. So it is not difficult to imagine a comic poet tying that story together with one about the spectacular and potentially spectacularly funny collapse of her first marriage. My point in putting forward this interpretation of these fragments of Nicophon is not to argue that it is true, although it might be. Instead, my real argument is of a different order, and is that the mere existence of Odyssey 8 exercises something like a magnetic effect on what little remains of the birth of Aphrodite, making it not just tempting, but almost inevitable that a reader familiar with Homer will attempt to put the fragments together in the way I have suggested, even if no one would have come up with the idea otherwise. Much historical and philological progress is arguably made via the process of analogy, but the fragility of such results must be constantly kept in mind. Perhaps the speaker of fragment 2 is in fact a Spartan herald, for example, and Aphrodite has come ashore at Cythera, and the action in Nicophon's play actually took place on the human level. With those remarks in mind, I turn to my primary text, Cratinus fragment 147, item 3a. The verses are quoted by Athenaeus, and when I translated them for the Loeb edition, I thought about the definite article in the middle of line 1 and the adjective at the end of it, decided that the first speaker must be Penelope and the second the disguised Odysseus, and that what is preserved is a fragment of a reworking of the interview of the disguised hero by his wife in Odyssey 20, and translated it as it appears on your handout, item 3b. Where did you please see my husband, the beloved son of Laertes? On Paros, where he was buying a huge seed-filled cucumber. Castle Austin, on the other hand, take the speakers to be the Cyclops and Odysseus. And when Ian Story translated the fragment for his new Loeb edition of the Old Comic Poets, he objected that, quote, the comedy seems to have been a parody of Odysseus and the Cyclops, not of the larger story, and he rendered it as in item 3c. Where did you once see the man, Laertes' dear son? On Paros, buying a jumbo-sized pumpkin. I, for my part, was producing an edition not of the comic poets, but of Athenaeus, and the fact was that I had not thought as hard as I might have about the likely plot of Cratinus' play. So when I looked at Story's Loeb for the first time, I was dismayed at my own stupidity. And this paper is a further reaction to that experience. How do we know, I will ask, the likely contents and structure of Cratinus' play? Put another way, what magnetic fields led Castle Austin and Story after them to the conclusion that the first speaker in fragment 147 must be the Cyclops, in defiance, it should be said, of what seemed, and seems to me, the obvious surface sense of the first line. At the end of this paper, I will offer some specific tentative reconstructions of the plot of Odysseus. I will not claim to have escaped the alternately virtuous and vicious circle of analogy and reconstruction. My larger goal, however, is to argue that we ought to be cautious, or at least self-conscious, when we draw such conclusions, especially in regard to the structure of fragmentarily preserved texts. I begin with 4 additional fragments of Cratinus' play, Cratinus' play, items 4a to d. The first 3 have what has traditionally seemed an obvious, easily identifiable dramatic context. Fragment 150, item 4a, is patently the Cyclops threatening the men he has trapped in his cave. In return for which I'll take all you noble companions and cook you in various ways and dip you in various sauces, and whoever of you all looks the most well-roasted, I'll gobble him down, soldier. Fragment 145, item 4b, is Odysseus addressing the Cyclops a little later on. Here, take this now and drink it, and immediately ask me my name. And item 146, item 4c, is the Cyclops after he has tasted the fateful wine his visitor has given him. I never drank such a maron, that is, such moronic wine, nor will I drink it in the future. Whether fragment 149, item 4d, is Polyphemus explaining the grounds for the punishment he intends to deal out, or Odysseus attempting to hearten his men for another stage of their adventure, perhaps encouraging them to meet the monster whose possessions they have been plundering, is unclear. You sat there all day long, feasting on white milk, dining on bee stings, and filling yourselves with curds. But although fragment 146 is only conjecturally assigned to this play, the material combined is, to all appearances, a relatively faithful, if intriguingly polymetrical adaptation of the famous story in Odyssey 9, in which Odysseus and his men visit the Cyclops cave and steal his food, are trapped and some of them eaten there, and ultimately get the monster drunk and then escape with help from the false name Utus. Polyphemus has grown a bit more civilized than in Homer. He is now prepared not just to cook the Achaeans rather than eating them raw, as in the Odyssey, but to cook them in at least 4 different ways and to eat them with 3 different sauces, and only to pick the most perfectly roasted for consumption. And apparently the setting has evolved a bit as well, as fragment 148, item 4e, seemingly part of a messenger speech or the like, featuring a vivid historical presence suggests. But they all try to escape beneath the couches. Runkle suggested the speaker here must be Odysseus, describing the behavior of his companions. But couches belong to a symposium, not a cave doubling as a goat pen, and the natural conclusion is that the other Greeks were lying on them before they decided to climb underneath instead. So what we have in Cratinus' play seems to be not so much a botched burglary, as in Homer's version of the story, as a dinner party gone terribly wrong, a point whose implications I will take up later in this paper. The Homeric story of Odysseus and the Cyclops was clearly well known in the 5th century, and thus readily available for comic adaptation. In the opening scene of Aristophanes' Wasps, item 5, for example, Philocleon's final ploy to escape the house is to suspend himself beneath the donkey that is being taken off to the market to be sold. When spotted, the old man claims to be Utus, nobody, but he then goes on to identify himself as an Ithacan and suggests that his captors may be interested in eating him. And once he has been unceremoniously shoved back inside, a large stone is placed against the door to keep it closed. We also know of a satyr play by the tragic poet Aristeus, active in the 460s or so, of which we have only a single fragment, item 6, but enough to suggest that Aristeus' Cyclops too was a symposiist, not just an unwilling drunk. You ruined the wine by adding water to it, perhaps addressed to Odysseus. The earliest and most intriguing evidence, however, comes from the Sicilian playwright Epicharmus, active in the first half of the century, of whose Cyclops we have 3 short but suggestive fragments. Fragment 70, item 7a, by Poseidon much more hollow than a mortar, perhaps said of a large drinking vessel. Fragment 71, item 7b, entrails are delicious by Zeus as is the ham, easily taken as an appreciative evaluation of a meal or anticipated meal by a sophisticated man-eating monster. And fragment 72, item 7c, come on after you pour it into the drinking cup, which suggests that Polyphemus was once again got drunk by his visitors. Not only was the sub-Homeric 5th century Cyclops seemingly a quite amusing character, therefore, but the comic and satyr play versions of the story, as widely imagined and reconstructed, including in this paper so far, are all strikingly similar. The monster somehow comes into contact with and or captures Odysseus and his men. There is a feast, but a more sophisticated one than in the Odyssey. Polyphemus is offered wine and gets drunk, and the Greeks escape, presumably after blinding him. But the fact is that we do not know even that much about these lost plays, and if the generic plot I have just described sounds strikingly like that of the surviving Euripidean Cyclops, that is, I suggest, no accident. We know what went on in the Cyclops, and we know that there were other 5th century stage adaptations of Homer's story, and the attraction of the one complete text we have is such that all these other plays come to resemble it. Thus, Penelope cannot be speaking in Plotinus Fragment 147 because Penelope cannot be in a play entitled Cyclops because she is not a character in the one complete play entitled Cyclops we have. As noted earlier, analogy is a powerful tool for recovering lost poetic structures, making this a difficult argument to escape. What I propose to do in the second half of this paper, however, is to look at some other 5th and 4th century cyclopes and to use the diversity apparent there to open up additional possibilities for how Plotinus may have presented the story. The crucial figure in this connection is the lyric poet Philoxenus of Cythera, about whose biography and work we know relatively little, in part because ancient scholarship routinely confused him with the dithyrambic poet Philoxenus of Leucas. But Philoxenus of Cythera is several times associated with Dionysius I, tyrant of Syracuse, circa 405 to 367 BCE, and he thus belongs to the late 5th or early 4th century, making him a rough contemporary of Aristophanes in the second half of his career, and of other comic poets such as Nicophon, already discussed, and Antiphanes and Nicochares, to whom I will come in a moment. What PMG presents as 10 fragments of Philoxenus, Cyclops, or Galatea are preserved, and a number of them contain elements of traditional character and story discussed earlier. Polyphemus is a rustic figure who seemingly keeps goats, PMG 820 equals item 8a. He captures Odysseus in his cave and terrifies him, PMG 824 equals item 8b. And at some point he says to him, "You sacrificed, you will be sacrificed in turn," PMG 823 equals item 8c. How Philoxenus' story ended is less clear. Odysseus speaks PMG 824, item 8b again, in retrospect, so he must escape the cave. The chorus of Aristophanes' Plutus mocked the slave character Cario by quoting and parodying Philoxenus' poem, PNG 820, item 8a again, comparing Cario to a drunk Cyclops, collapsed on the floor and subsequently blinded. But the chorus might be running several versions of the story together for comic effect, and similar objections can be raised to Athenaeus' claim, PMG 821 equals item 8d, that by referring to another character's beautiful eyes, Philoxenus Polyphemus ironically anticipated what Odysseus would do to him. The best evidence that Philoxenus Cyclops was ultimately blinded would seem to come from a later scholarly interpretation of the poem, PMG 816, to which I return in a moment, according to which it was written to mock the tyrant Dionysius. There are good reasons to think that the anecdote this interpretation preserves about how the relationship between the poet Philoxenus and his host Dionysius fell apart is untrue. But other sources report that Dionysius was so far-sighted that he was unable to find dishes on the dinner table without assistance, which is to say that he was, mockingly put, blind, and the various bits and pieces thus seem to add up to the thesis that Philoxenus Cyclops, like Homer's and Euripides, lost his eye. The other striking feature of Philoxenus Polyphemus is his love for a sea nymph named Galatea, literally milky white, that is, as white as the Cyclops' own milk and cheese. According to Aristophanes' Plutus and the scholia to that play, item 8e, Polyphemus appeared in Philoxenus' play playing the lyre, a sound the nonsense word thretanolo was apparently supposed to represent, and teasing Galatea, or stirring her up, which probably means encouraging her to come out of the water to meet with and perhaps marry him. We also have several fragments of Philoxenus' poem in which the Cyclops praised his beloved's beauty and charm. PMG 821-2 equals items 8D and F. And if we follow Burke and Page in believing that a version of the story preserved by the 5th century CE Christian bishop Synesius of Ptolemais, PMG 818, comes more or less direct from Philoxenus, perhaps Odysseus offered to charm Galatea for Polyphemus as a way of escaping the monster's cave. The significant point, at any rate, is that Philoxenus' Cyclops had an erotic side, and that he was thus not just once, but twice disappointed at the end of the poem. Not only did he fail to eat Odysseus and lose his eye as a result, but he also failed to get the girl for whom he pined. That those two disasters were intertwined is suggested once again by the ancient interpretation of the poem I alluded to earlier. According to Phineas of Aresius, one of Aristotle's students, among whose work was a treatise on the Sicilian tyrants, from which the anecdote must be drawn, references in item 8G on your handout, Dionysius had a lover named Galatea, and when he caught Philoxenus trying to seduce her, he had the poet thrown into the quarries. Phineas claims that Philoxenus wrote the Cyclops or Galatea there, modeling Polyphemus on Dionysius, Galatea on the tyrant's lover, and Odysseus on himself. Whether one believes all this or not, the implication is that the poem presented something like a love triangle. The Cyclops did not get Galatea because Odysseus came between them, perhaps because she found the hero more attractive than the monster. Indeed, one can easily imagine Odysseus at the end of the poem sailing off into the sea towards Ithaca, escorted by his sea goddess lover, and leaving the hopeless, hapless Cyclops behind. This image of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, as a clumsy, rustic lover of a woman far too good for him, was taken over by the middle comic poet Antiphanes, 3 fragments of whose Cyclops survive. The first, at fragment 129, equals item 9A, might reasonably be taken as a comment by the monster himself, explaining how he plans to finance the wedding or the marriage, although one must admit that this is a very tentative thesis. The other 2 fragments are catalogs of food. Fragment 130 equals item 9B of seafood. Fragment 131 equals item 9C of herd animals and their products, which the speaker and someone else aspired to share, and is presumably part of a wedding banquet catalog or the like. Meineke took the speaker of fragment 130 to be Polyphemus, explaining what his bride, as a sea goddess, will be able to contribute to the projected meal, although there is no reason why the line should not be assigned to Galatea herself. But the tragedy, and thus the humor, comes in fragment 131, which can only be a list of the Cyclops' anticipated contribution, and which begins with lovingly detailed descriptions of various sorts of cows, goats, and pigs, but ends pathetically with, and cheese, and cheese, and cheese, and cheese, and cheese, and cheese. Even less survives of Nicocare's comedy Galatea, which must date to about the same time as Philoxenus' poem, a question to which I return in a moment. But Nereids were mentioned in the play. Fragment 6 equals item 10A, among them presumably Galatea herself, and someone says to someone else, fragment 4 equals item 10B, what in the world, are you worse educated than Philonides of Melite? Fill in the name of your own favorite boorish political figure here, which, as Meineke again saw, is easily taken to be Galatea abusing her would-be lover. And while we have no idea what went on in the play beyond this, the difficulties a bumbling, one-eyed goatherd had in negotiating a love affair with the sea goddess were certainly fundamental to the story. Nicocare's play is undated, but inscriptional evidence from the Attic Victors list suggests that his career began in the last decade of the 5th century or so. The Suda knows 9 titles and calls him, for what it's worth, a contemporary of Aristophanes, and one of his other plays was, in fact, performed in the same contest as Plutus in 388 BCE. What one would like to know is whether Nicocaris Galatea is earlier than Philoxenus Cyclops or Galatea, otherwise dated only by the quotation and reference to it in Plutus, and thus whether the idea of an erotic Polyphemus was invented by Philoxenus or was widely available by his time, and perhaps therefore also available for Plotinus. Euripides' satiric Cyclops has no substantial love interest, although Silenus is forced to serve as the monster's Ganymede at one point, but is simply a parodic version of Odyssey 9. And on that basis, I have argued, it is routinely assumed that Plotinus Odysseus too must have lacked an erotic element, and must similarly have been restricted to a travesty of Odyssey 9. But those are dubious assumptions based on little more than accidents of survival and the magnetic field generated by the small number of texts that we have complete. Whether Polyphemus had a romantic side before Philoxenus of Cythera composed his Cyclops or Galatea is impossible to say, although the performance of Nicocaris Galatea around the same time raises the possibility that he did. But in any case, Philoxenus saw the erotic potential of the monster, and his poem had a sufficiently wide appeal to be parodied at least once in comedy by Aristophanes, so there is no reason why another poet should not have had a cognate idea a generation earlier. Nor, as I will argue in a moment, are we required to believe that the plot of Plotinus Odysseus was as simple as it is usually made out to be. Before taking up that point, however, I return to fragment 147, item 11. One can easily manufacture reasons why Polyphemus might ask for news of Odysseus' whereabouts and refer to him as Ton Andra, translating the words the man, and even more unexpectedly as the dear son of Laertes. One can also generate explanations for why the second speaker, presumably Odysseus himself, might put the Cyclops off, but claim to have seen the hero elsewhere, proving that he is still alive, although otherwise occupied. But the far more likely and obvious conclusion, I suggest, if one simply looks at the fragment itself, is that the first speaker is Penelope, who appropriately refers to Odysseus as my husband, Ton Andra, who is dear, Philon, to her. The question then becomes, why is Penelope in a Cyclops play? In the final section of this paper, which is to say now, I offer two suggestions, neither susceptible of proof, but worth considering nonetheless. The first suggestion is that by some plot twist we can only very tentatively reconstruct, Penelope has made her way to Cyclops Island, fallen into Polyphemus' hands, and become an object of erotic fascination for him. Penelope ought not to do this, but surely that sort of ought not is at the core of one type of mythological parody. Perhaps Odysseus' wife has gone to look for him, as Telemachus does in Homer's story, and has been shipwrecked, kidnapped, or the like. In addition to the Polyphemus, Galatea, Odysseus love triangle reconstructed for Philoxenus' poem, one might compare Euripides' Helen of 410 BCE, a very similar comic tale of a hero's wife stranded in a distant land, threatened by a barbarian lover, and ultimately rescued by her husband. Alternatively, and with consequences of a different sort for our understanding of Plotinus' dramaturgy, in her typically inventive and insightful discussion of the opening sections of Odysseus, Emanuela Baccola, item 12, has shown that the play must have begun with a storm at sea, in the course of which the hero and the chorus of Ithacan sailors traveled through the orchestra in an elaborate stage boat, finally coming to shore near the edge of the raised stage on what was presented as the island of the Cyclopes. Baccola emphasizes the enormous investment, practical and dramatic, made by the playwright in this boat, and thus in the opening sequence of the comedy. But she also goes on to insist on no substantial evidence that the rest of Plotinus' play must have taken place before Polyphemus' cave, because dramatic settings of comedies do not change radically once the action is underway. although Aristophanes' piece, where the scene oscillates between heaven and earth, is an obvious counterexample, and there is no reason why Plotinus should not have done what he wanted in this regard in any case. And to the extent that Bacola is right about the extent of the poet's investment in the boat and the orchestra, I would suggest it is that much less likely that he abandoned it after the opening sequence. Platonius, item 13, gives us our only real summary of the plot of Plotinus' play, and he calls it a parody not of the Cyclops story, but of the Odyssey to Kur. And once we recognize that Odysseus and his men may well have set sail a second time, or even a third, there is no reason why fragment 147 should not belong to a comic Penelope and Odysseus, playing out a version of their traditional Homeric story back on Ithaca. In that case, the couches in fragment 148 might belong to the Megaron in the palace, so that this becomes part of a parodic description of the battle in Odyssey 22, not of the confrontation with the monster in his cave. Indeed, to follow up this train of argument, one can imagine a plot in which Odysseus and his men are blown not to the Cyclopes island, as in Homer, but straight to Ithaca, where Polyphemus has, for some once again indecipherable reason, taken up residence, like the suitors in the traditional version of the story, courting Penelope and eating up the household's food in the meantime, so that the various mythic exemplars collapse neatly and amusingly in upon one another. As the papers delivered at this conference have all made clear, structure is a rich but problematic term. Some of the specific arguments I have advanced today about Plotinus Odysseus are open to objection and debate. But the fact that they are is fundamental to my larger point. In matters of this sort, we often do better to admit what we do not know, and thus to acknowledge the range of possibilities for lost dramatic structures, rather than clinging to a few sure facts that are no facts at all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Olson, for a wonderful paper reminding us to be cautious about how much we don't know. But the good thing is how much left, how little left, but how many possibilities.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, now the panel questions. Please, Serena.
I find your argument very convincing. And there is a fragment of Plateaunicos in the Nux Magna. The speaker is probably Alcmena, and she uses almost the same words referring to her husband. So maybe it could be
Tonaka. That's very useful. Thank you.
useful for you. And then I have a question. What is your explanation for the title? It's not very concerning your paper, but I'm curious.
I can only repeat what people always say, which is that it must mean Odysseus and his companions. Clearly, Odysseus and companions are involved in the story, but I have nothing more clever. You know, people always quote archilochoi and other things that don't seem like they should be plurals, right? But seem to be. So I have nothing original to say about that.
Что касается, да, значит, два вопроса, то есть одно замечание, один вопрос. Что касается, вопрос касался заглавия вот этого произведения Каратина, которое достаточно дебатируемое. Профессор Олсон говорит, что у него нет ничего, так сказать, оригинального добавить, что, как обычно, он приводит, что Одиссей его спутники, а, собственно, замечание доктора Пилота было, что у комедиографа Платона есть параллельное место таким же обращением к мужу, который может быть здесь, который здесь может быть, так сказать, полезным в качестве параллели. Еще вопросы? Чисто?
Yes, just a remark which might maybe strengthen the second hypothesis, that the setting might be in part or completely or in Ithaca. As far as I remember, in one of the fragments, which probably, I think not in 3 meters, but in another meter, which might belong to the chorus, but the fragment which is not in the handout, yes, at least mentioned or at least hinted at that they are really heading for Ithaca. And it's okay, you usually can assume they're just by error arriving on the island, but it could be that they are really on their way, they're following the indications how to get to Ithaca. I think that's what the fragment was about, and it might also be that they really arrived there.
I like that. I think that's a great idea. That's good.
Да, собственно, замечательный фрагмент, где говорится, что доктор Рот говорит именно о том, что здесь вполне возможно предположить, что собственно, проблема в том, чтобы спросить дорогу до Итаки, и возможно, какие они в итоге до Итаки добирались.
Once one starts playing with this, interesting things happen. You know, I mean, for example, when he first lands on Ithaca, of course, the first thing that he sees is the cave of the nymphs, right? I mean, so in other words, there you've got, and that's the same thing that happens in Odyssey 9 in a sense, right? So you can really see the stories kind of potentially imposing themselves on one another very amusingly. And maybe they don't know where they are, right? You know, they think maybe a monster lives here, but it turns out the cave of the nymphs and they're home.
В действительности это как раз демонстрация того, как многие вещи могут быть по-разному интерпретированы, как одно накладывается на другое, когда, как известно, первое, что видит Одиссей, возвращаясь на Итаку, он видит пещеру, и вообще-то это может быть пещера какого-нибудь очередного чудовища, благо у него есть такое опыт, а это оказывается пещера нимф, и, соответственно, с этим тоже, конечно, могли играть, в том числе и в комедии.
You mentioned several times the context of the symposium. I'm not sure I understood what you made of that fact. I mean, of those allusions to the symposium.
Well, do you want to address that question? One of two things is happening. What happens it looks like happens in many of the other Cyclops adaptations is that the Cyclops becomes a symposiast. At least that's what happens in Euripides, right? The alternative that I'm suggesting is that perhaps it is referring to a banquet in Odysseus' halls.
Oh, that's okay.
In which it's perfectly appropriate to have banquet benches and all this.
Вопрос касался параллелей с пиром, симпосием, на который обращал внимание профессор Олсон. Соответственно, в чем смысл этих параллелей? Профессор Олсон ответил, что в действительности это, так сказать, стандартная тема в связи с циклопом, хотя, с другой стороны, в принципе, параллели, и где циклоп выступает как симпосиаст, но в действительности параллели могут быть и сталкиваться и другим способом, потому что, в конце концов, мог быть и пир по возвращении Одиссея в Итаку, в дворце.
Yes. In that case, does it mean fragment 148 could refer to the suitors? The ones who go and hide under the... Yeah, anything is possible.
It could be that Odysseus is with his men in the hall when they're fighting. I mean, it's something bad has happened and people are hiding, and after that, you know, it's just like, well, take your choice.
Yes, but I mean something bad happening in the banquet hall. I mean, obviously.
Whatever it is clearly a parody or a playoff of what goes on in Book 22 when the suitors scatter. Yeah, who exactly is doing the scattering, I don't think there's any way to know.
Значит, сейчас замечание касалось того, не может ли фрагмент 148, 4Е, касаться в таком случае, если речь идет о пире во дворце, относиться к женихам. Возможно, потому что что-то происходящее дурное в зале пира, конечно, предположительно какой может быть, но в действительности количество возможностей здесь по сути не исчерпательно.
Мой вопрос, как всегда, будет не очень замысловат.
Только короче, и...
Да, естественно. И коснется скорее рефлексии, чем непосредственно темы драматургии, но все-таки интересно было узнать мнение доктора Олсона вот на какой счет. Не является ли тот факт, что практически нигде не обыгрывая, вот, как я понимаю, в представленных фрагментах тему этимологического, фонетического сходства